His hand grazed her face as if touching an open wound, afraid to hurt, yet unable to pull away. She felt the warmth of his fingers pierce her scarred skin, and the entire hall seemed to vanish. The silence pressed heavier than any accusation. His eyes, deep as chasms, searched for something she wasn't sure she could offer. And when he whispered her name, for the first time, as if it were a prayer, she knew nothing would ever be the same. Before we dive into this tale, leave a comment with a rating from 1 to 10. And tell us which city you're tuning in from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart. The wind wailed through the tower's cracks like an ancient lament, carrying the scent of damp earth and cold ashes. Aurora kept her eyes fixed on the darkness pouring through the narrow window, her hands resting on the stone sill as if she could, through touch, absorb something from a world that had never truly been hers. The night was thick, almost solid, and she felt its weight on her shoulders like an invisible shroud. She had arrived at Stonehaven, keep 3 moons ago, brought by strange hands that had plucked her from the only place she'd ever known. The children's home in the southern foothills, where silence was her sole constant companion, and where she'd learned her existence was a mistake the world tolerated but never celebrated. They told her she'd be useful there, that her skilled hands would serve to care for the Lord's children. No one mentioned these children were the offspring of Lord Maximilian himself, the patriarch of Stonehaven, whose presence made the air tremble, and whose name was whispered with reverence and awe in every corner of the realm. Aurora took a deep breath, feeling the cold air scratch her throat. Downstairs, in the chambers warmed by generous fires, the little ones slept. Ethan and Hannah, 5-year-old twins, with angelic faces that hid a wild vivacity. She had become their shadow, their silent guardian, a presence as invisible as it was indispensable. The servants looked at her with disdain, the ladies of the court pretended she didn't exist, and the head housekeeper, a woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper tongue, made sure to remind her daily of her place, the lowest, the most expendable, the most forgotten. But the children loved her. They loved her with the brutal purity of innocence, who understood neither hierarchies nor titles. To them, Aurora was the honey-haired girl who sang lullabies when the thunder roared, who invented stories of gentle dragons and warrior princesses who never scolded them when they broke things or soiled their clothes. And in that simple love she found something akin to purpose. The keep was a labyrinth of dim corridors and whispered secrets. Aurora had learned to walk without a sound, to keep her eyes down, to occupy the least space possible. She had become an expert at disappearing, at existing on the margins, in the shadows, in the corners where no one looked. And so, invisible, she observed. She observed the intrigues woven like spiderwebs among the nobles, the alliances that formed and dissolved at the whim of petty interests, the ambitions that gleamed in the eyes of those who circulated through the ornate halls. And she watched him. The Lord, the patriarch. Maximilian was a presence that shifted the temperature of any room he entered. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a bearing that exuded natural authority, he walked as if the world were merely an extension of his will. His hair was black as a moonless night, and his eyes, his eyes, were a stormy grey that seemed capable of reading souls. Aurora had never seen him truly smile. The most she'd witnessed was a faint curving of his lips when his children ran toward him, and even that seemed a luxury he rarely allowed himself. He didn't see her. Of course he didn't. She was less than a shadow in his world of treaties and battles, of decisions that shaped the destinies of thousands. When he passed her in the corridors, which happened rarely, as Aurora meticulously planned her routes to avoid encounters, his eyes slid over her as if she were part of the furniture, a particularly plain tapestry or a candelabra no longer in use. And Aurora told herself that was fine, that she preferred invisibility to attention, that anonymity was a form of protection. But sometimes, in the depths of night, when the candles flickered and shadows danced on the walls of her small attic room, she allowed herself to imagine what it would be like if those grey eyes truly saw her, if they recognized something more than just the nameless servant. It was a dangerous thought, a dream she crushed every morning before even opening her eyes, burying it in the same place where she kept all the other impossible hopes she had learned to silence. Spring arrived in Stonehaven with an almost timid hesitation, as if asking permission to colour the fields still scarred by the harsh winter. Aurora accompanied the little ones in their play in the castle's inner gardens, watching them run among the rose bushes that were beginning to bud, their laughter echoing through the stone walls like crystal bells. Hannah had brought a daisy chain she insisted on placing in Aurora's hair, and Ethan had solemnly declared that she was now a true princess. Aurora smiled, a genuine smile that illuminated her face for a fleeting instant before she hid it again under the mask of composure she had learned to wear. She hadn't realized that, from the highest window of the West Tower, a pair of grey eyes watched the scene with an attention he himself didn't quite comprehend. It was that same week that rumours began to circulate, like poison, throughout Stonehaven Keep. Whispers of threats on the borders, of mercenary bands attacking villages in the Stonehaven lands, of a conspiracy to weaken the patriarch's rule. Aurora heard fragments in the kitchens, where she sometimes fetched warm milk for the little ones, and in the corridors, where servants chatted, thinking no one was paying attention. Her heart tightened at the news. Not for herself. Her life had never been worth much in the world's eyes. But for the children, for the little ones who slept trusting that the world was safe, that nothing could touch them, within the protective walls of their father's keep. There was also another name that arose with increasing frequency in these conversations: Lord Cassian, the patriarch's cousin and closest advisor. A man of easy smiles and even easier words, who moved through the court with the grace of a serpent among flowers. Aurora had crossed paths with him a few times, and something in his gaze had made her recoil instinctively, like an animal sensing a predator before even seeing it. He had noticed her. It was evident in the way his eyes lingered on her, cataloguing her, evaluating her. And that attention, unlike the patriarch's indifference, didn't make her feel seen. It made her feel exposed, like marked prey. The head housekeeper, Lady Beatrice, summoned her one rainy afternoon to her private office, an austere room that smelled of lavender and authority. Aurora kept her eyes down as she received instructions about an upcoming ceremony, a banquet to celebrate an alliance with a neighbouring realm. The children were to be immaculate, well-behaved, invisible until called for a brief appearance. Aurora nodded at each command, memorizing every detail, every expectation, every way she could fail and be punished. "And you," the head housekeeper said, with that tone that made Aurora feel smaller than she already was. "Make sure you stay out of sight, completely out of sight. We wouldn't want the guests to think we employ—" She paused, her lips twisting in distaste. "Unsuitable types to care for Stonehaven's heirs." Aurora swallowed the humiliation, as she swallowed so many others, with a silent nod and a heavy heart. It wasn't the first time her appearance had been questioned, her unknown origin used as a weapon. "Daughter of no one," they said. Without blood, without lineage, without worth, beyond what her hands could offer in labour. That night, as she cradled Hannah, who'd had a nightmare, Aurora allowed herself a single tear. It fell silently onto the sleeping girl's forehead, and she quickly wiped it away, as if she could also erase the pain that had birthed it. She promised herself, as she promised every night, that she would be strong, that she didn't need recognition or belonging, that it was enough to exist on the margins, to protect those little hearts that trusted her, and perhaps, just perhaps, that would be enough to justify her presence in the world. There were nights when Aurora stayed awake until the candles melted into pools of wax on the candelabra, her eyes tracing the pages of books, secretly lent by a kind servant who saw in her a curiosity that deserved to be nourished. She read stories of improbable heroines, of women who defied their destinies and found greatness in the most unexpected places. And though she knew they were just stories, she allowed herself, in the quietest hours, to imagine that perhaps, just perhaps, there was something beyond this existence on the margins. Head housekeeper, Beatrice was particularly cruel on rainy days, as if the dampness soured her temper even further. Aurora had learned to predict her moods by the way her keys jingled as she walked, by the angle of her shoulders, by the almost imperceptible tension in her jaw. It was a survival skill she'd developed over months, a way to anticipate the blows before they landed. "You," Beatrice said on a particularly grey morning, "will be responsible for cleaning the guest chambers for the banquet. Each room must be spotless by nightfall, or there will be consequences." Aurora knew the task was impossible. There were 12 rooms, each requiring hours of meticulous work, and she would have to care for the children simultaneously. But arguing with the head housekeeper was as productive as arguing with the castle stones, so she simply nodded and began her impossible day. The castle corridors seemed endless when one was exhausted. Aurora moved through them like a ghost, her feet aching, her hands chapped from constant labour, her body protesting against unending demands. But whenever she passed the chambers where the twins played, whenever she heard their laughter echoing through the stone walls, something lit up in her chest, a small but stubborn flame that refused to be extinguished. On that specific night, as Aurora finally dragged herself back to her small room after completing the impossible task minutes before the deadline, she paused before a window overlooking the inner gardens. The moon was almost full, its silvery light transforming the rose bushes into sculptures of silver and shadow. It was beautiful, in a melancholic way that tightened her heart. A figure caught her eye, tall, imposing, motionless as a statue among the roses, Maximilian. The patriarch stood there, alone, his face turned towards the sky as if seeking answers in the stars. There was something in his posture that Aurora had never seen before. Not the unyielding authority, not the calculated coldness, but something that looked terribly like loneliness. She retreated before she could be seen, but the image stayed with her as she ascended the last steps to her room. The lonely patriarch, the man who had everything and, apparently, nothing. It was a thought that shouldn't occupy a servant's mind, and Aurora pushed it away with the same determination with which she dismissed all other improper thoughts. Outside, the rain began to fall, hesitant drops that would soon transform into a deluge, washing the ancestral stones of Stonehaven Keep, carrying ancient secrets to the rivers that snaked through the valleys. The wind howled through the corridors like an omen, and in the shadows that gathered in the darkest corners something stirred, something patient, something hungry, something that awaited the perfect moment to strike. Aurora didn't know it, but her life was about to change in ways she could never imagine. And it would all begin on a night of hidden moon, when silence would be torn by the sound of arrows slicing through the air and her body would become a shield against death. The moon hid behind heavy clouds when Aurora woke with her heart pounding. She didn't know what had torn her from sleep, perhaps a sound, perhaps just the animal instinct she'd developed after years of constant vigilance. Her tiny attic room was plunged into darkness, and she lay motionless for long seconds, breath held, ears attuned to any disturbance in the keep's quiet. Then she heard it. A rustle that wasn't the wind, a creak that wasn't old wood settling, footsteps, furtive, calculated steps. That didn't belong to any servant or guard she knew. Instinct propelled her before thought could catch up. Aurora sprang from bed, her bare feet hitting the cold floor, and ran. Not for her safety, not to seek help, but directly to the children's chambers, 3 floors below, where Ethan and Hannah slept under the illusory protection of stone walls. Her feet flew down the steps, her heart thundering in her ears, every shadow transforming into a threat. The keep was eerily silent, the corridors deserted of guards who should have been there. Something was terribly wrong, and Aurora knew. So, with that visceral certainty that needs no proof, that the little ones were in danger. She reached the antechamber of the children's quarters at the exact moment she saw the figures. 3 men dressed in black, faces covered, moving with the precision of predators. 2 of them had already entered the children's room, and the third stood guard, a bow in his hands, an arrow nocked, ready to silence any witness. Time seemed to slow, each second stretching like heated wax. Aurora saw everything with crystal clarity. The metallic gleam of the arrow tip, the half-open door revealing, the shadowy forms of the invaders approaching the beds where the little ones slept, the absolute terror that froze her blood and paradoxically ignited her soul. She didn't think, didn't calculate, didn't hesitate. She lunged into the room with a cry that erupted from the depths of her being, a primitive sound of protection that tore through the night's silence. The invaders whirled, startled by the interruption, and Aurora saw in an agonizing flash the arrow one of them aimed directly at Ethan still asleep, oblivious to the horror unfolding around him. She stepped in between, simply stepped in between, her slender body transforming into a barrier between death and innocence. The first arrow struck her shoulder with a force that made her stagger, the pain exploding in waves of liquid fire. But she didn't fall. Couldn't fall. Behind her, Hannah was beginning to stir, her blue eyes wide with terror. "Run," Aurora whispered, her voice strangely calm despite the chaos. "Run and scream." The second arrow pierced her back as she turned to shield Hannah, who had finally found her voice to scream. The third came soon after, and the fourth, and Aurora lost count as her body became a repository of agony. Each impact was a thunderclap in her flesh, each metal tip a sentence she willingly accepted, because every arrow that struck her was an arrow that didn't reach the children. 7. There were 7 arrows in total, though she would only discover this much later. 7 wooden shafts with sharp tips that tore through her skin, her muscles, perhaps her very life. She fell to her knees first, then toppled to her side, her vision darkening at the edges, the sound of Hannah's and Ethan's cries mingling with the alarm that finally echoed. Through the keep. Blood spread beneath her like a scarlet river, warm against the cold stone. Aurora tried to move, to shield, to do something, anything, but her body no longer responded. She was trapped in an armor of pain, each breath a Herculean effort, each heartbeat an improbable victory. The invaders fled. She heard their hurried footsteps, heard voices shouting orders, heard the keep awaken in chaos. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the sound, the blessed, wonderful, miraculous sound of the children crying. They were alive. They were crying, and crying meant breathing, meant existing, meant she hadn't failed. A strange peace enveloped her then, soft as black velvet. Aurora closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the world dissipate, the pain become distant, almost unreal. If this was dying, she thought vaguely, it wasn't so terrible. She had fulfilled her purpose. She had protected. And perhaps that was enough. The last thing she registered before darkness claimed her were voices, a voice actually deep and hoarse, torn by an emotion she couldn't identify. And hands. Large hands that touched her with a delicacy that didn't match their evident strength, that brushed sweat-soaked hair from her face, that pressed her wounds as if they could, through sheer will, prevent life from escaping her ravaged body. "Don't die," the voice commanded, and there was something almost desperate in that order. You are not permitted to die. Aurora wanted to laugh at the irony of receiving her first direct order from the patriarch at the moment of her death. She wanted to say that wasn't how it worked, that she didn't control what happened next. But her strength had run out, and all she managed was a fragile sigh before consciousness finally faded. Maximilian carried her through the keep, ablaze with torches and shouts, his face a stone mask that hid the maelstrom roaring within him. The servant girl, the nameless woman who cared for his children, lay in his arms like a broken doll, her blood staining his clothes, his skin, his hands. 7 arrows, 7 damn arrows, and she was still breathing, still fighting, still refusing to yield. The healers had already been called when he laid her on the infirmary table with more care than he had ever shown anything in his life. Hannah and Ethan were safe in the arms of their attendants, their small faces stained with tears, asking for the storyteller girl, wanting to know if she would be all right. Maximilian had no answer to that question. Looking at the ravaged body on the table, the arrows still lodged like grotesque branches, he doubted anyone did. "Do whatever it takes," he ordered the healers, his voice cutting like steel. "Use every resource available. If she dies—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't know how to. He stepped back, but not far. He stayed in the shadows, watching as the healers worked. With frantic efficiency, removing the arrows one by one, cleaning wounds that seemed endless, stitching torn flesh with trained fingers. The young woman, he discovered her name was Aurora, a name he had never bothered to learn, made no sound, plunged into an unconsciousness that was perhaps a blessing. The hours stretched like centuries. Dawn painted the sky pink and gold, indifferent to the drama unfolding in the keep's chambers. The healers worked to exhaustion, and when they finally stepped away, their faces held no hope. "We've done what we can, my lord," the eldest said, his hands still stained with blood. "The next few hours will be crucial. If she survives the night—" He didn't need to finish. Maximilian nodded, dismissing them with a gesture. When he was alone with her, he approached the bed where they had laid her, wrapped in bandages that were already beginning to show red stains. She was so small, so fragile. How could someone so insignificant have done something so extraordinary? He vaguely recalled seeing her in the corridors, in the gardens with the children, always on the margins, always in the shadows. He had never paid her mind, never considered her to be anything more than a replaceable servant among many. And now she lay there, suspended between life and death, because she had chosen, without hesitation, without calculation, without expecting anything in return, to protect his children with her own body. Maximilian pulled up a chair and sat beside the bed. It wasn't something he typically did, to wait, to watch, to show concern for someone outside his immediate circle, but something held him there, a force he couldn't name. Perhaps it was gratitude, perhaps it was shame for never having truly noticed her. Perhaps it was simply the need to witness if that flickering spark of life in her ravaged body would manage to resist the darkness. He spent the entire night there, and the next, and the one after that. The fever came first, a bonfire that seemed to consume Aurora from within. She deliriously mumbled disconnected words, calling out names he didn't recognize, weeping for a mother she had likely never known. Maximilian changed the cool cloths on her forehead, holding her hand when the tremors became too violent, feeling strangely helpless before an enemy he couldn't fight with swords or strategies. The keep functioned at its altered pace. The investigation into the attack was underway, suspects interrogated, defenses reinforced. Cassian, his cousin and advisor, visited him once in the infirmary, his eyes sliding over Aurora's unconscious form with something Maximilian couldn't quite decipher. "A tragedy," Cassian said, his voice distilling a sympathy that didn't reach his eyes. "But perhaps it's for the best, cousin. She clearly won't survive, and keeping her alive will only drain resources that could be used on more urgent matters. Maximilian felt something cold trace his spine. He turned to his cousin, and something in his gaze made Cassian take a step back. "She will live," the patriarch said, each word laden with a promise that sounded almost like a threat. "And when she lives, she will be treated with all the honors her courage deserves. Are we clear?" Cassian inclined his head in silent assent, but there was something in his smile, something twisted, calculating, that lingered with Maximilian long after his cousin had left. In the days that followed, Aurora drifted between consciousness and oblivion, brief moments of lucidity interspersed with long hours of feverish delirium. The healers visited her regularly, their expressions gradually shifting from despair to cautious surprise. The wounds against all expectations were healing. The fever, though persistent, hadn't worsened. "It's extraordinary," the head healer murmured during one of his visits, genuinely perplexed. "Anyone else would have succumbed days ago. She has a will to live that defies all medical logic." Maximilian said nothing, but his eyes remained fixed on Aurora's pale face, where a faint colour was beginning to return to her cheekbones. A will to live. Yes, he could see it in her, a stubborn flame that refused to be extinguished. No matter how many winds tried to blow it out, the 10th day brought a change. Aurora opened her eyes, truly opened them, not that delirious semi-awakening that had characterized her moments of consciousness until then, and found herself in a room she didn't recognize. Light filtered through heavy velvet drapes, painting the room in amber and honey tones, and there was an aroma in the air she couldn't identify, something woody and earthy, mixed with medicinal herbs. She tried to move and immediately regretted it. Pain exploded through her body like a constellation of searing needles, and she let out an involuntary groan that seemed to have been torn from somewhere deep within her being. "Don't move." The voice startled her. It was deep, hoarse, laden with an authority that brooked no questioning. Aurora turned her head, the only movement she could execute without the pain felling her again, and her heart stopped for an agonizing instant. Lord Maximilian sat in an armchair beside her bed, his grey eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made her momentarily forget all her wounds. He looked exhausted. There were shadows under his eyes, stubble darkening his chin, and his clothes, which she had always seen as immaculate, were rumpled, as if he hadn't changed them in days. "The children," Aurora managed to whisper, her voice little more than a thread of sound. It was the first thing she needed to know, the only thing that truly mattered. Something crossed the patriarch's face. Surprise, perhaps, or something deeper she couldn't name. "They're well," he replied, and there was a note in his voice that sounded almost gentle, completely different from the cutting tone she had heard him use so many times. "They're well because you—" He stopped, seeming to wrestle with words that wouldn't find adequate expression. Aurora watched him, fascinated despite herself, seeing for the first time cracks in the impenetrable armor of Stonehaven's lord. "Thank you," he finally said, and the words seemed to cost him immense effort, as if he wasn't accustomed to uttering it. "What you did. There are no words. There's no way to repay you." Aurora wanted to say that she didn't need repayment, that she had only done what any decent person would do, that the little ones deserved to live far more than she did. But her throat was too dry for speeches, and all she managed was an almost imperceptible nod that made her wounds protest in unison. Maximilian stood, and Aurora realized with a jolt that he held a glass of water. He approached the bed and, with a delicacy that seemed impossible for those large and powerful hands, helped her to drink. The water was cool, a blessing that slid down her parched throat like rain on arid land. "The healers said it would be impossible," he continued, setting the glass aside when she finished. 7 arrows. No one survives 7. Arrows. But here you are." There was something in his gaze that Aurora couldn't decipher, a mixture of respect and curiosity, and something more that made her feel strangely exposed. She averted her eyes, fixing them on the drapes, unable to sustain that scrutiny. "I need to rest," she murmured, using the pain as an excuse to end a moment that was becoming too much for her to process. Maximilian nodded, but didn't immediately move to leave. For a moment that seemed to stretch into infinity, he remained there, looking at her with that indescribable expression. Then, almost, as an afterthought, he reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face, the touch so light it could have been imagined. "Rest," he said, and there was a promise in that simple word. "I'll be back." When the door closed behind him, Aurora allowed herself to breathe. Air entered her lungs in tremulous gulps, and she realized her hands were trembling, not from pain, but from something entirely different. Something that felt terribly like the onset of an earthquake in her heart. The days that followed established a routine Aurora could never have predicted. Maximilian visited her daily, sometimes 2 or 3 times, bringing news of the children, asking about her recovery, simply sitting in silence while she rested. Initially, these visits made her nervous, hyper-aware of his every movement, every word he uttered. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, the tension began to dissipate. He told her stories about Ethan and Hannah, how the boy now insisted on sleeping with a small wooden sword to protect Aurora when she comes back, how the girl drew elaborate pictures to decorate the room where the brave young woman was recovering. Aurora listened, her heart aching with a sweet longing, and sometimes chuckled softly, ignoring the pang of pain the movement caused. "You love them," Maximilian said one afternoon, more an affirmation than a question. "You love them as if they were your own." Aurora considered the observation for a moment, her fingers idly toying with the edge of the sheet. "They are the only ones who saw me," she finally replied, the words escaping before she could censor them. "Not as a servant or a foreigner or whatever else others see when they look at me. They just saw me. As Aurora." The silence that followed was dense, laden with meaning. When Aurora finally mustered the courage to lift her eyes, she found Maximilian watching her with an expression that seemed almost ashamed. "I didn't see," he admitted, and the confession seemed torn from some reluctant part of his being. "I didn't see you, nor so many others who inhabit this keep. I was blind to everything that wasn't my own world." Aurora didn't know what to say. His honesty disarmed her, exposed fissures in her own carefully constructed armor of indifference. "You're the patriarch," she said, because it was the only answer. That made sense. "You have the entire realm on your shoulders. You can't be expected to see every person who—" "I can," he interrupted, his voice firm. "And I should. A leader who doesn't see their people doesn't deserve to lead them." There was a change in him, Aurora noticed, a softening of the hard edges that defined his bearing, a vulnerability she suspected few had ever witnessed. And something in that transformation both attracted and terrified her in equal measure. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into something akin to a new normal. Aurora slowly regained her strength, each day bringing small victories, being able to walk to the window, to sit unassisted, to take her first shaky steps across the room. And with each of these achievements, Maximilian was present, watching with that intensity that made her forget how to breathe. He told her stories about his own childhood while she rested, about a stern father who believed love was weakness, about a gentle mother who had died too young, about the years of brutal training that had transformed him into the man he was. Aurora listened in silence, absorbing every word, building an image of a lonely boy who had learned to hide his pain behind masks of power. "Why are you telling me these things?" she asked one night, when the vulnerability in his stories became almost unbearable. "You barely knew me a few weeks ago. I was just the servant who cared for your children. Maximilian considered the question for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the flickering candle flame between them. Because you saved me, he finally said. Not just my children, but me. You made me see how lost I had become, how much I had forgotten, what truly matters. And perhaps, he hesitated, as if the confession to follow was too difficult to utter. Perhaps I need someone to know me, truly know me. And something tells me you are that person. The air between them grew thick, laden with meanings neither was prepared to articulate. Aurora felt her heart quicken, a warmth rising up her neck and flushing her cheeks. This thing that was happening was dangerous and impossible and completely out of her control. The weeks of recovery brought an unexpected intimacy. Aurora learned that Maximilian had nightmares about his wife's death, which occurred during the twins' birth. She learned that he carried overwhelming guilt for failing to protect her, for having failed the only person he'd vowed to safeguard. She learned that his coldness was an armor, not a truth, a protection against a world that had already taken too much from him. And he, in turn, learned about her childhood at the children's home, about the lonely nights crying in silence so as not to bother anyone, about the dreams she had forbidden herself to have because dreaming was a luxury for those with a future. He learned that she sang when she thought no one was listening, that she loved the smell of rain on dry earth, that her eyes lit up when she spoke of the children in a way no title or wealth could buy. The head housekeeper, Lady Beatrice, didn't approve of this closeness. Aurora perceived it in the cutting glances she received during medical visits, in the whispered comments that pretended not to be heard, in the way her lips pressed into a thin line whenever Maximilian mentioned the heroine of the keep. She's filling his head with nonsense, the head housekeeper murmured to Cassian in a conversation Aurora accidentally overheard, hidden behind a curtain during one of her first attempts to walk. An orphan with no lineage, no name, nothing to offer, but who knows what she offers? Patience, Cassian replied, and there was something in his tone that made Aurora's blood run cold. Maximilian is too sentimental for his own good. It's a weakness that can be exploited at the right moment. Aurora retreated silently, her heart pounding, her mind processing what she had just heard. Something was happening in the shadows of the keep, something that involved the patriarch's cousin, and that certainly boded no good. But with whom could she share her suspicions? She was a nobody. Her word carried no weight against that of an established advisor. And what if she was wrong? What if she was misinterpreting an innocent conversation? The following days were spent in careful observation. Aurora, growing stronger but still limited in her movements, began to pay attention to details that had previously escaped her. The frequent visits of unknown men to Cassian, the conversations that ceased abruptly when someone approached, the glances exchanged between the advisor and certain guards who seemed more loyal to him than to the patriarch himself, and the disappearing supplies, food, weapons, medicine, small quantities at a time, easily attributed to carelessness or common theft. But Aurora, with her years of experience in surviving by observing, saw a pattern where others saw only coincidences. Maximilian continued his visits, oblivious to the conspiracies weaving around him. Aurora debated with herself about telling him her suspicions, but always hesitated at the last moment. What if he didn't believe her? What if he thought she was trying to sow discord to gain favours? The line between her current position, precarious yet secure, and a downfall was too thin to be tested with accusations lacking concrete proof. But when she finally managed to get out of bed and take her first shaky steps across the room, supported by Maximilian's arm, he had insisted on being present for that moment. Aurora knew that the time for indecision was running out. The shadows were stirring, the predators preparing for their strike, and this time She couldn't physically interpose herself to protect those she loved. This time, she would need to use something different. She would need to use the only thing she had always possessed in abundance, her ability to observe, to remember, to connect dots that others didn't even perceive. The approaching battle wouldn't be one of arrows and blood. It would be one of words and secrets, of truths revealed and lies unmasked. And Aurora, the nameless orphan who had dared to defy death, was determined to win it. Spring ripened into summer when Aurora finally regained the ability to walk unaided. Her wounds had transformed into scars, 7 jagged marks that mapped her body like constellations of survival, and though pain still visited her on cold nights or with sudden movements, she had learned to live with it like a silent companion. The twins greeted her with a joy that melted every bit of resistance in her heart. Hannah cried, clutching her waist, hot tears dampening the fabric of her simple dress, while Ethan bravely tried to contain his own emotions, proudly displaying the small wooden sword he had kept to protect her. Aurora knelt, ignoring the protest of her scars, and enveloped them in her arms, breathing in the scent of innocence and trust that emanated from them. The warmth of those small bodies against hers was a balm for wounds that weren't just physical. During the weeks of recovery, when fever consumed her and pain seemed unbearable, it had been the memory of these children's laughter that had kept her fighting. They were her anchor, her reason to keep breathing when it would have been so easy to simply give up. "We made drawings for you," Hannah said, wiping away tears with the back of her hand. "Every day we made drawings. Ethan said mine were ugly, but I think they're pretty." "I didn't say yours were ugly," Ethan protested, blushing. "I said mine were better." Aurora laughed, and the sound seemed to ease something in the air, as if the entire keep exhaled with her. "I want to see all of them," she said. "Every single one, and you're going to tell me everything that happened while I was sleeping." "You slept a long time," Hannah observed with that brutal frankness of children. "Dad said you were fighting invisible monsters inside you. Is that true?" Aurora hesitated, searching for the right words to explain something even she didn't fully comprehend. "I think so," she finally said. "But I won. I'm here now." "Never leave again," Hannah pleaded, her voice muffled against Aurora's shoulder. "Promise you'll never leave again." Aurora couldn't promise that. She didn't know what the future held, had no control over the forces that moved the gears of her destiny. But looking at those small faces, stained with tears and hope, she made the only promise within her power to make. "As long as I live, I'll be here for you." Maximilian watched the scene from the doorway, his face as unreadable as ever. But something in his eyes, something soft and vulnerable, betrayed the emotion he tried to hide. When Aurora finally stood, supported by the children who refused to let go of her hands, their gazes met over the little ones' heads. No words were exchanged, but a silent understanding passed between them, a recognition that something had irrevocably changed, something neither of them was yet prepared to name. Aurora's new position in the keep was ambiguous. Officially, she remained the children's guardian, but the way she was treated had transformed. The servants greeted her with a mixture of respect and curiosity. The guards inclined their heads slightly when she passed. Even some ladies of the court, who had previously ignored her completely, now watched her with speculative glances that made her uncomfortable. Only 3 people remained unchanged in their hostility. Head housekeeper Beatrice, whose antipathy had solidified into something akin to hatred. Cassian, whose easy smile never reached his eyes when directed at her. And a young noblewoman named Valerie, Maximilian's distant cousin, who saw Aurora as a rival in a competition Aurora herself hadn't even known she was participating in. It was Valerie who worried her most. Beautiful, educated, and impeccably connected to the court's webs of power, she represented everything Aurora was not. Her dresses were of imported silk, her hair always arranged in elaborate styles, her manners, polished to perfection. And she had something Aurora would never possess: noble blood. Ancestral lineage, the undeniable right to belong to that world of marble and velvet. "The little heroine," Valerie said in a casual encounter in the corridors, her words sweet as poisoned honey. "I've heard much about you. The orphan who threw herself in front of arrows for the love of the children. Very touching." Aurora kept her face neutral, years of practice in hiding emotions serving her well. "I merely did my duty, my lady." "Oh, of course," Valerie smiled, a gesture that didn't warm her eyes. "It's truly admirable how household staff can be so dedicated, almost like animals, in the way they attach themselves to their masters." The comparison was deliberate, an attempt to put her in her place. Aurora swallowed the anger that rose in her throat and forced a serene smile. "Loyalty knows no social class, my lady. It simply exists where it finds fertile ground." Something flashed in Valerie's eyes, surprise perhaps, at a response that wasn't entirely submissive. She opened her mouth to reply, but was interrupted by the arrival of Maximilian, who appeared in the corridor with long strides, his presence immediately altering the dynamic of the encounter. "Aurora," he greeted, and there was a warmth in his voice that didn't go unnoticed by Valerie. "The healers would like to see you for a final assessment. May I escort you?" It was an offer Aurora knew she should refuse out of decorum. A patriarch escorting a servant through the halls of his own keep was unheard of, a breach of protocol that would fuel gossip for weeks. But before she could formulate a polite refusal, Maximilian had already offered his arm, his grey eyes fixed on hers with an intensity that made her forget all the rules. "It would be an honour, my lord," she murmured, accepting the offered arm and ignoring the furious glare Valerie shot at her back. They walked in silence through the stone corridors, their footsteps echoing in a rhythm that seemed almost intimate. Aurora was hyper-aware of the warmth radiating from him, of the contained strength in his arm beneath her fingers, of the subtle scent he exuded, wood and leather, and something essentially masculine that made her heart quicken in unsettling ways. "You don't have to do this," she finally said when they were far enough from curious ears. "You don't have to defend me or escort me or any of these things. You're already causing enough talk." Maximilian stopped, turning to face her directly. His eyes sought hers, and Aurora felt trapped in his gaze like an insect in amber. "Do you care?" he asked, genuinely curious. "About the gossip?" Aurora considered the question. Did she care? Gossip had always pursued her, about her unknown origins, about her appearance that didn't fit any recognizable standard, about her very existence that some saw as an insult to the natural order of things. "I'm used to it," she admitted, "but I don't want to cause trouble for you. You're the patriarch. You have responsibilities, expectations." "I have the right to choose my own company," he interrupted, and there was a firmness in his voice that brooked no argument. "And if I choose to spend my time with the bravest woman I've ever known, that's my business and no one else's." The words hung suspended between them, laden with implications Aurora dared not examine too closely. She felt a blush rise up her neck, warming her cheeks, and averted her gaze, unable to sustain the intensity of that moment. "You are very kind, my lord," she murmured, using formality as a shield. "Maximilian," he corrected, his voice softer now. "When we're alone, I prefer you call me by my name." It was a simple request, but Aurora understood its weight. Names were power, intimacy, a bridge across the chasm that separated their stations. To accept was to step towards something that both terrified and attracted her in equal measure. "Maximilian," she repeated, and the name sounded like a caress on her lips, a promise of possibilities she dared not contemplate. He smiled, a true smile that lit up his stormy eyes and transformed his stern face into something almost beautiful. And Aurora felt something release in her chest, a tension she hadn't even known she was carrying. They continued their walk, but something had changed. The air between them vibrated with a different energy, a mutual awareness that colored every gesture, every glance, every shared silence. And in the shadows of an adjacent corridor, dark eyes watched the scene with cold, calculated rage. Cassian clenched his fists, his jaw tight, his mind already working on ways to destroy the connection forming before his eyes. The orphan was becoming a problem that needed to be eliminated. The following days brought an escalation in the keep's tensions. More supplies vanished. Guards Aurora had identified as loyal to Cassian were found in strategic positions, replacing the Patriarch's trusted men. And rumors began to circulate about imminent attacks, about enemy forces gathering on the borders. Aurora observed everything with keen eyes, memorizing details, connecting the dots. She knew she needed to speak with Maximilian, tell him her suspicions about his cousin. But how? With what proof? And even if he believed her, how could he confront a conspiracy that seemed to have such deep roots? The answer came from an unexpected source. One night, as she cradled Hannah, who once again couldn't sleep, Aurora noticed a shadow moving in the gardens below the window. Curious, she watched as a hooded figure slipped among the rose bushes, heading for a side door Aurora knew was rarely used. Something compelled her to follow. Perhaps it was the same force that had made her throw herself in front of arrows, that protective instinct that seemed oblivious to concepts like self-preservation. She left Hannah asleep under the care of a sleepy attendant and descended silently down the service stairs, her steps light as a ghost's. The side door led to a corridor connecting to the dungeons, a place Aurora had never visited, a part of the keep that existed only in whispered stories. She followed at a distance, keeping to the wall, shadows. Her heart thundering so loudly she feared she'd be discovered at any moment. The figure stopped before a cell at the end of the corridor, and Aurora stifled a gasp when she recognized the profile revealed under the flickering torchlight. Cassian. And in the cell before him, chained and clearly mistreated, was a man Aurora recognized as one of Maximilian's most loyal guard captains, a man who had supposedly deserted weeks ago. "You will tell me where he keeps the seals." Cassian's voice was cold, devoid of any trace of the sympathy he usually displayed. "Or your family will suffer the consequences." Aurora recoiled, her blood running cold in her veins. There was the proof she needed. There was the confirmation of all her suspicions. But when she turned to flee, her eyes met other eyes in the darkness, familiar eyes that recognized her the instant she recognized them. Head housekeeper Beatrice. And by the gleam in her eye, Aurora knew she had been discovered. The world seemed to suspend in crystal for an infinite instant. Aurora and the head housekeeper faced each other across the darkness of the corridor, two women separated by an abyss, of class and circumstance now united by a secret that could destroy them both. It was Beatrice who moved first. With surprising agility for her age, she seized Aurora's arm and pulled her into an alcove hidden behind an ancient tapestry, covering the young woman's mouth with a firm hand before she could utter a sound. "Silence," the head housekeeper hissed, her dark eyes gleaming with something Aurora couldn't identify. "If you value your life, don't make a sound." Aurora nodded, her heart thundering against her ribs. Beatrice slowly released her but kept a hand on her shoulder as a silent warning. "You saw." It wasn't a question. "You saw the advisor with the prisoner." Aurora hesitated for a moment, weighing her options. Lying would be useless. The head housekeeper clearly already knew the answer. And something in Beatrice's posture made her hesitate to immediately categorize her as an enemy. "I saw," she admitted in a low voice. "And I know what it means. He's conspiring against the Patriarch." Beatrice let out a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of years of secrets. "Finally," she murmured, almost to herself. "Finally, someone else sees." Aurora blinked, confused by the unexpected reaction. You knew? The head housekeeper chuckled softly, a joyless sound that echoed in the shadows. Child, I've managed this keep for 30 years. Little escapes my eyes. I saw Cassian plotting from the moment he arrived a decade ago with his easy smile and soft words. I watched him poison the mind of the previous patriarch, saw him sow discord among siblings, watched him wait patiently as everyone around him fell or weakened. But then why? Aurora couldn't complete the question. Why didn't I say anything? Beatrice finished for her, her voice bitter. Because I'm just a housekeeper, child. A servant. Like you. Our word means nothing against that of a noble, especially one as skilled at manipulating appearances as Cassian. I needed proof. Someone who could bring that proof to the patriarch in a way he would believe. Something clicked in Aurora's mind. That's why you were so hostile toward me, she said slowly. Because Maximilian, the patriarch, began to trust me. Beatrice nodded, a shadow of regret crossing her face. I needed to push you away from him. The closer you became, the more Cassian would see you as a threat, and I didn't want... She stopped, seeming to wrestle with the words. I didn't want you to become his next target. There's already too much blood on his hands, blood of innocent people who simply stood in the way of his ambition. Aurora felt a chill run down her spine. How many people had been silenced for knowing too much? How many accidents and desertions were, in truth, covered-up murders? And now, she asked, her voice firm despite the fear growing in her chest, what do we do now? Beatrice studied her, for a long moment, as if re-evaluating everything she had thought about her. You're braver than I expected, she finally admitted. Or more foolish. Perhaps both. But since we're trapped together in this, we need to act before Cassian realizes he's been watched. The two women hatched a stealthy plan right there in the shadows of the dungeon corridor. Beatrice knew every secret passage in the keep, every servant whose loyalties were unquestionable, every weakness in Cassian's network. Aurora had something equally valuable, the patriarch's trust, a connection no conspiracy had managed to anticipate or neutralize. They parted with an agreement to meet again the next day in a safe location. Aurora returned to the children's chambers with a heavy heart and a mind buzzing, finding Hannah still asleep and the attendant softly snoring in her chair. She lay down on her small cot in the corner of the room, but sleep was slow to come. Every shadow seemed to hide threats. Every creak was a possible conspirator approaching. Dawn found her exhausted, but determined. She had a role to play now, a mission that transcended her own survival. For Maximilian, for the children, for all those who would be destroyed if Cassian achieved his goal, whatever it might be, she needed to be strong. She needed to be clever. She needed to be everything she never thought she could be. The following days were filled with almost unbearable tension. Aurora continued her normal routines, caring for the children, strolling through the gardens, accepting Maximilian's visits with a smile that hid the turmoil within her. But beneath the surface, she and Beatrice worked in silence, gathering evidence, identifying allies, mapping the extent of the conspiracy. What they discovered was even more disturbing than they had imagined. Cassian wasn't just planning to seize power, he had sold Stonehaven to an enemy realm, promising to deliver the keep and its defense secrets in exchange for recognition as the new lord of the lands. The attack that had nearly killed the children hadn't been the work of random mercenaries, but of agents from that realm, sent to eliminate the heirs and facilitate the transfer of power. Aurora felt nauseous as she understood the depth of the betrayal. The arrows that had torn her flesh were only the beginning. If Cassian triumphed, there would be much more blood. The blood of all who opposed him, including Maximilian himself. It was Valerie who inadvertently accelerated events. Furious with the attention Maximilian devoted to Aurora, she allied herself with Cassian, believing his promises that she would be made Lady of Stonehaven when he took control. In her eagerness to eliminate her rival, She let slip information that reached Beatrice's ears. Information about a secret meeting that would take place on the night of the new moon, when the conspirators would finalize their plans. "It's our only chance," Beatrice said, her eyes gleaming with fierce determination. "If we can get proof of this meeting, irrefutable proof of the betrayal, not even Cassian will be able to escape." But the plan was risky. The meeting would take place in the North Tower, a difficult-to-access location heavily guarded by Cassian's men. Someone would need to infiltrate, witness, and somehow survive to tell what they had seen. "I'll go," Aurora said before she could think better of it. "I know that tower. I spent weeks recovering in a nearby room. I learned every shadow, every hiding place." Beatrice protested, argued, almost pleaded, but Aurora remained unshakable. This was her chance to finally do something that mattered, to use her gift for invisibility on behalf of those she loved. The night of the new moon arrived, cloaked in heavy clouds that seemed to presage a storm. Aurora waited until the children were asleep, kissed their foreheads with a tenderness that could have been a farewell, and slipped through the keep's dark corridors. Her heart pounded so hard she feared the guards could hear it. Every shadow seemed to hide threats. Every creak of old wood sounded like an alarm. Aurora moved as she had learned to move over years of invisibility. With silent steps, controlled breathing, eyes constantly sweeping her surroundings. The keep at night was a different place. Torches cast dancing shadows on the stone walls, creating illusions of movement where there was none. The wind seeping through the cracks produced sounds that could be whispers or moans. It was easy to understand why the more superstitious servants swore that ghosts inhabited the oldest corridors. Aurora didn't believe in ghosts. She believed in much more tangible threats. Men of flesh and blood with mortal ambitions and a willingness to kill. Every step was calculated, every breath controlled. She wore a dark dress borrowed from Beatrice, her hair pinned up under a black scarf, her body pressed against the walls as she slid from shadow to shadow. Cassian's guards patrolled with mechanical regularity, but Aurora had learned their patterns, memorized their routes, found the gaps in their vigilance. The North Tower rose against the moonless sky like a black tooth pointed at the stars. Aurora found the secret passage Beatrice had indicated, an opening hidden behind an ancient statue, and slipped inside, her heart pounding so hard she feared she'd be heard. The tower's interior was damp and cold, smelling of ancient stone and buried secrets. Aurora ascended a spiral staircase, her bare feet silent against the worn steps, until she reached a half-open door from which voices seeped like poison. She hid in a nearby alcove, pressing herself against the cold stone, and listened. Cassian's voice was unmistakable, laden with an arrogance he rarely displayed in public. "The army will arrive in 3 nights. The attack will be at dawn, when Maximilian is still in his chambers. The main gate guards are already ours, and with the chaos of combat, no one will realize that the true enemies are inside the walls." "And the children?" asked another voice, which Aurora recognized with a cold jolt as belonging to Valerie. "Accidents happen in battles," Cassian replied, with a coldness that made Aurora bite her own fist to keep from crying out. "It's a tragedy, of course, but a necessary one. We cannot leave heirs to contest our position." The conversation continued, detailing plans, naming accomplices, revealing the extent of a betrayal that encompassed dozens of people within and outside the keep. Aurora memorized every word, every name, every detail, engraving everything in her mind, with the desperate precision of one who knows that lives depend on her recall. When the meeting finally concluded and the conspirators began to disperse, Aurora began her careful retreat. But fate, as so often before, had other plans. A step gave way beneath her weight. The sound, a low but distinctive creak, echoed through the silent staircase like thunder on a calm night. "Who's there?" Cassian's voice cut through the darkness, followed by the sound of hurried footsteps. Aurora ran, all caution forgotten, her only thought to escape, to survive, to bring the truth to Maximilian. But the tower had only one exit, and between her and freedom stood the advisor's men. She saw the torchlight approaching, heard the shouts of alarm, felt panic rise in her throat like bile. Trapped. She was trapped. And when Cassian finally reached her, his face a mask of fury and triumph, Aurora knew her hope of exposure had turned into a deadly trap. "The little spy," he hissed, grabbing her arm with enough force to leave marks. "I must admit, I underestimated you. I don't make the same mistake twice." Aurora lifted her chin, refusing to show the fear that consumed her within. "Maximilian will know," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. "If you kill me, he will know it was you." Cassian laughed, a cold sound that contained no trace of humor. "Oh, my dear, when I'm done with you, everyone will know it was the head housekeeper herself who killed you, in a fit of jealousy over your closeness to the patriarch. 2 stones with 1 strike. I eliminate you and the only other person who suspected me." He signaled to his men, who advanced to seize her. Aurora fought, kicking and scratching every fibre of her being, refusing to accept the fate unfolding. But there were too many, too strong, and her strength, still compromised by her recent wounds, was no match for them. It was at that moment that a roar cut through the night. A roar Aurora would recognize anywhere, in any circumstance. A roar that belonged to only one person in the world. The tower door burst inward, and with it came Maximilian, his grey eyes transformed into storms, his body radiating a fury that seemed capable of felling mountains. Behind him, Beatrice wielded a torch, and dozens of loyal guards advanced with drawn swords. "Release her!" The patriarch's voice was low, controlled, infinitely more terrifying than any shout. "Release her now, or none of you will see the dawn." Cassian's men hesitated, fear evident on their faces. Their leader, however, still held Aurora, using her as a shield. "Cousin," Cassian said, his forced smile failing to hide the panic in his eyes. "This is a misunderstanding. The servant was found stealing. I know exactly what you did," Maximilian interrupted, each word falling like stone. "I know. About the approaching army, about the bought guards, about every name on your list of traitors. Beatrice told me everything before you could get to her. Your plan is over, Cassian." The advisor's mask fell completely, revealing the ugliness of his naked ambition. "You were always weak," he spat, tightening his grip on Aurora's arm with renewed force. "Weak for your dead wife, weak for your children, weak for this nobody who bewitched you. Stonehaven deserves a true leader, not a sentimental fool who places heart above power. Stonehaven deserves a leader who values his people," Maximilian replied, taking a step forward. "Every person, every life, every sacrifice, that's what this nobody taught me, and that's why you'll never win." What happened next was too fast for Aurora to fully process. Cassian, in a last act of desperation, drew a dagger and raised it against her, but before he could complete the strike, Aurora spun, using the momentum of her own body to unbalance him, a move she had learned by watching the guards training over months. The dagger flew, hitting the wall. Cassian stumbled, and Maximilian was on him in an instant, his hand closing around his cousin's throat with a force that spoke of years of betrayal finally exposed. "Don't kill him!" Aurora cried out, surprising everyone, including herself. "If you kill him, you'll be a murderer in some eyes. Let justice judge him. Let everyone see who he truly is." Maximilian hesitated, the battle visible in his eyes. Rage cried out for blood, for immediate vengeance, for a brutal end to the one who had threatened everything he loved. But Aurora's words cut through the fury, reminding him of who he wanted to be, of who she believed he could be. He released Cassian, who crumpled to the floor, gasping and defeated. "Seize him," he ordered, his voice regaining the cold calm of authority. He and all his accomplices will face judgment at dawn. Stonehaven's justice will be done. As the guards dragged the conspirators to the dungeons, Maximilian turned to Aurora. She was trembling, adrenaline finally giving way to shock and the retroactive fear of what had almost happened. Without a word, he enveloped her in his arms, pulling her against his chest with an intensity that spoke more than any speech. "You are the most infuriatingly brave woman I've ever known," he murmured against her hair. "And if you ever try anything like that again, I swear I'll—" He didn't finish the threat. Aurora didn't need him to. In that moment, enveloped in the warmth and security of his arms, she knew she had found something she had spent her entire life unknowingly searching for. A home, a purpose, a heart that beat in rhythm with hers. And no conspiracy, no prejudice, no ancestral tradition would ever be able to take that from her. Dawn broke over Stonehaven, painted pink and gold, indifferent to the dramas that had unfolded in the hours of darkness. Aurora watched the sun rise from Maximilian's chambers, a place she never imagined she'd be, but where she had been brought for treatment of her injuries and for safety while the last conspirators were captured. Her wrists were bandaged where Cassian had grabbed her with brutal force, and there were scratches on her arms that still stung. But that was nothing compared to the wounds she had almost received, to the death she had almost met for the second time in a few months. Maximilian had remained by her side all night, refusing to leave her even when urgent matters demanded his attention. He had delegated what he could, resolved the bare minimum, and always returned to her, as if fearing she would vanish the instant he took his eyes off her. "You saved my life," Aurora said, when the silence between them became too heavy to bear. "How did you know where to find me?" Maximilian let out a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of an entire night of terror. "Beatrice," he explained. "She came to me the moment you left for the tower. She told me everything. About the suspicions, about the conspiracy, about your two-woman plan. I wanted to kill her for getting you involved in that, but she argued that you had chosen to go on your own, that nothing would stop you." "And she was right," Aurora confirmed, turning to face him. "I had to do it. I had to be me." "Why?" The question came out as a hoarse whisper, laden with an emotion he rarely showed. "Why do you keep putting yourself in danger? First the arrows, now this. What drives you to risk everything?" Aurora considered the question for a long moment. It was something she herself wondered, in the silent hours of the night when sleep was slow to come. "Because for most of my life I didn't matter," she finally said, the words coming from a deep and vulnerable place. "I was invisible, disposable, a presence the world tolerated but didn't value. And then I found the children, and they made me feel needed. For the first time, there was someone who needed me, who would be sad if I disappeared. And when I saw those arrows aimed at them, I knew I would rather die than let them be harmed." She paused, gathering courage for what would come next. "And you," she continued, her voice softer now. "When I started to know you, when I saw who you truly are beneath all that armor of coldness, I wanted to protect that too. To protect the man who visits a wounded servant every day, who tells stories about his children with sparkling eyes, who admits his mistakes and tries to be better. That man deserves to live. That man deserves to lead. And if I could do something to ensure that anything, I would." The silence that followed was thick as velvet. Maximilian watched her with an intensity that made her feel transparent, as if he could see through all her defenses, all her masks, to the vulnerable core she hid from the world. And then he moved. He crossed the distance between them in 2 long strides and enveloped her in his arms for the second time that night. But this time it was different. This time there was no urgency of rescue, no imminent danger. There were just the two of them, suspended in a moment that seemed to exist outside of time. "You matter," he said. the words vibrating against her hair. You mattered from the first moment I saw you in my children's arms, singing them to sleep. I was just too blind to recognize it. Aurora felt the tears before she realized she was crying. They streamed silently down her face, dampening the fabric of his shirt, carrying with them years of loneliness and invisibility that finally found a witness. I know I'm not who you should choose, she said, her voice choked. I have no noble blood, no dowry, nothing to offer, but— Stop, he interrupted, pulling back just enough to cup her face in his hands, his thumbs drying her tears with a tenderness that contrasted with the evident strength of those fingers. Stop diminishing yourself. You have courage that shames warriors. You have wisdom that surpasses advisors. You have a heart that saved my children and, with them, saved me. If that is not worthy of a patriarch, then nothing is. His eyes sought hers, grey meeting brown in a collision that seemed to rearrange the universe. I love you, Maximilian said, and the words fell like stones into the lake of silence, creating ripples that spread infinitely. I love you, Aurora. Not because you saved my children, not because you unmasked Cassian, but because you are the most extraordinary person I have ever known. And if you'll allow me, I want to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of you. Aurora couldn't reply. The words were lost somewhere between her throat and her lips, blocked by the magnitude of what she was hearing. Then she did the only thing that felt right in that moment. She rose on her tiptoes and pressed her lips against his. The kiss was hesitant at first, an initial contact laden with uncertainty and years of repressed longing, but it quickly transformed into something more, deeper, more urgent, more true. His hands found her waist, hers gripped his shoulders, and for a blessed moment the world outside ceased to exist. When they finally separated, both were breathless, their hearts beating in a synchronized rhythm that felt like a promise. Yes, Aurora whispered, answering the question he had asked. Yes, I will. The trial of Cassian and his accomplices took place 3 days later, in a public ceremony at the Keep's gates. All of Stonehaven attended, nobles and commoners, merchants and farmers, all united by the need to witness justice being served. Aurora was present, beside Maximilian, in a position that caused murmurs and speculative glances. She wore a simple but elegant gown, a gift from Beatrice, who had become an unlikely ally, and her hair was styled in an arrangement Hannah had insisted on, decorated with small garden flowers. Cassian was brought in chained, his face marked by defeat and impotent rage. Beside him, Valerie wept silently, all her beauty unable to save her from the consequences of her ambition. Maximilian read the accusations with an unwavering voice, each word falling like a hammer blow upon the guilty. Treason, conspiracy, attempted murder of the heirs, alliance with enemy realms. The list was long, the evidence undeniable, the verdict inevitable. The details were excruciating. Intercepted letters that showed the extent of the betrayal. Testimonies from guards who had been coerced into participating in the conspiracy and now sought redemption through truth. Records of payments received from foreign agents. Each piece of evidence was a stone upon the tomb of Cassian's ambitions. Aurora watched the faces in the crowd as the evidence was presented. There was shock in many. People who had trusted Cassian, who had believed in his easy smile and soft words. There were also those who seemed relieved, as if a weight they had secretly carried had finally been lifted from their shoulders. Valerie, beside Cassian, had lost all the composure that characterized her. Her face was streaked with tears, her once impeccable hair now dishevelled. Aurora felt a pang of something that might have been pity. After all, Valerie had been manipulated, used as a piece in a game she didn't fully comprehend. But the pity was weak against the memory of the cruelties the young noblewoman had inflicted upon her, the calculated humiliations and the gazes laden with scorn. Your lives will be spared, the patriarch declared, and a murmur of surprise rippled through the crowd. Not out of mercy, but because death would be too swift an end for such treachery. You will be exiled to the frigid northern wastes, where you will spend the rest of your days in forced labor, remembering with every moment the price of your ambition. It was a sentence worse than death, for someone like Cassian, who had always valued comfort and power above all else. Aurora saw horror spread across his face as he comprehended his fate, and she felt a dark satisfaction she hadn't known she possessed. The ceremony concluded with an announcement no one expected. Maximilian raised his hand, asking for silence, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a solemnity that made everyone lean in to listen. "There is one more matter that needs to be addressed," he said, "an injustice that needs to be corrected. For years, this keep, this realm, operated on the premise that worth is measured by blood and lineage. I myself believed this, blind to the qualities that existed right before my eyes." He extended his hand to Aurora, who accepted it with trembling fingers, her heart thundering in her ears. "This woman," Maximilian continued, pulling her to the center of the dais, "saved my children with her own body, risking an agonizing death to protect those she loved. This woman uncovered and exposed a conspiracy that would have destroyed everything we value. This woman taught me the true meaning of courage, loyalty, and love." He paused, his eyes meeting hers with a tenderness that seemed impossible for someone of his standing. "And this woman," he concluded, his voice firm and clear, "has given me the honor of accepting my suit. From today forward, Aurora is no longer a servant or a guardian. She is my betrothed, the future Lady of Stonehaven, and anyone who disrespects her will be disrespecting me." The silence that followed lasted only an instant before exploding into a cacophony of reactions. There was shock on some faces, indignation on others, but there was also, and this surprised Aurora more than anything, applause. First isolated, then growing, until a wave of approval swept through the crowd. She saw faces she recognized among those applauding. Servants she had worked alongside, guards she had greeted in the corridors, even some ladies of the court who had witnessed her courage on the night of the battle. It wasn't universal acceptance. That would take time if it ever came completely. But it was a start, a recognition that worth was measured not in blood, but in actions. And when Ethan and Hannah ran to embrace her, shouting with joy at finally having the complete family they had always wished for, Aurora knew she had found something she had spent her entire life searching for. It wasn't power. It wasn't wealth. It wasn't even Maximilian's love, though that was too precious for words. It was belonging. The certainty that there was a place in the world where she was seen, valued, loved, not despite who she was, but because of who she was. And that, more than any title or position, was the greatest treasure she could have found. Autumn painted Stonehaven in shades of amber and rust, covering the keep's gardens with a crisp carpet of leaves that crackled underfoot. Aurora walked among the dormant rose bushes, her burgundy velvet gown caressing the ground, her unbound hair swaying with a breeze that smelled of change. The air held that characteristic crispness that preceded winter, a reminder that the world kept turning, indifferent to the dramas and triumphs unfolding within the stone walls. Aurora breathed deeply, feeling the cold fill her lungs, remembering all the mornings at the children's home when winter meant hunger and despair. Now it meant feasts in warmed halls, soft fur throws and hot chocolate served in porcelain cups. The transformations still left her dizzy sometimes. She would wake in silk sheets and spend a moment disoriented, searching for the hard cot of her old attic room. She would look at her own hands, now soft and cared for, and barely recognize the fingers that were once rough from labor. It was as if she had lived two distinct lives, separated by a night of arrows and blood. 3 moons had passed since the night that had changed everything. 3 moons of adaptation, of learning, of discoveries that sometimes left her breathless. The life of the patriarch's betrothed was radically different from anything she had known. There were protocols to memorize, etiquette to master, glances to ignore. But there was also Maximilian, constant as the tide, her safe harbor amidst the storms of a transformation that still left her dizzy. She sat on the stone bench where she had so often watched the twins play, her eyes lost on the horizon where the sun began its golden descent. The scars on her body had grown less painful with time, mere echoes of a night that seemed to belong to another life, another Aurora. But she carried them without shame, like medals, from a battle that had forged her into something new. "You're pensive," Maximilian's voice reached her before his presence, that deep, comforting timbre she had learned to love more than she thought possible. He sat beside her, the warmth of his body radiating through layers of fabric, his hand finding hers in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. "I'm remembering," she replied, lacing her fingers through his. "How it was before, how it is now. How the world can change completely in the blink of an eye." Maximilian squeezed her hand, his thumb tracing slow, circles on her skin. "Regrets?" It was a question he asked occasionally, a vulnerability he hid beneath the armor of confidence he wore for the world. Aurora always turned to him when she heard it, searching his eyes so there would be no doubt in her answer. "Never," she said, and the word carried the weight of absolute truth. Not for an instant, not even on the difficult days. And there were difficult days. Stonehaven's court was not a gentle place for strangers, much less for an orphan raised to a position many considered usurped. There were whispers, in the corridors, glances that cut like knives, comments that pretended not to be heard but were calculated to wound. Aurora had learned to navigate this sea of veiled hostility with a grace that surprised even herself. She had discovered reserves of strength she hadn't known she possessed, an ability to hold her head high even when the weight of judgment threatened to crush her. And she had unexpected allies. Beatrice, who had become an unlikely mentor, teaching her the secrets of courtly politics. Some of the younger ladies, who saw an inspiration in her. And the household staff, who treated her with a genuine respect born from the years she had been one of them. But her greatest strength came from within the walls of her own chambers. Ethan and Hannah had become her light, her reason to smile even on the darkest days. The boy, now nearly 6, insisted on calling her Mom, a liberty Aurora had allowed after weeks of resistance and tears. Hannah, in turn, followed her throughout the keep like a small red-haired shadow, absorbing every gesture, every word, every way of being. "They're waiting for you," Maximilian said, breaking the contemplative silence that had settled between them. "They promised they'd only sleep after you told them a story." Aurora smiled, that smile that illuminated her face in a way that still took his breath away. "Always a story," she said, standing and pulling him with her. "I'll eventually run out of repertoire." "You?" he teased gently, wrapping an arm around her waist as they walked back to the keep. "The woman who invented 17 different endings for the same story about the dragon who was afraid of fire? Impossible." She laughed, and the sound echoed through the gardens like crystal bells, startling the last birds seeking shelter for the night. The children's room was warmed by the fireplace, the little bodies already tucked under soft covers, their eyes gleaming with anticipation when Aurora and Maximilian entered. There was an established routine for these nights. Aurora sat in the armchair between the two beds, Maximilian leaned against the doorframe watching, and the story began to weave itself into the air like a tapestry of words. That night, Aurora told a different story. She told of a girl born with nothing, no family, no name of consequence, no place in the world. She told how this girl learned to hide in the shadows, to expect nothing more than the bare minimum, to build walls around a heart that was afraid of being hurt. And she told how this girl, against all odds, found courage where she thought there was none. She found love where she expected only indifference. She found a home not in four walls, but in three hearts that beat in unison with hers. "It's you," Hannah whispered, her eyes wide with understanding. "The girl in the story is you." Aurora nodded, her voice choked with overflowing emotions. "And you," she said, touching each of their faces, "you are the treasures she found, the treasures that made it all worthwhile." Ethan snuggled out from under the covers to hug her, his small arms squeezing her with a strength that belied his size. "I love you," he said against her shoulder, "more than dragons, more than swords, more than anything." Hannah joined the hug, creating a pile of bodies and laughter and tears that Aurora knew she would cherish in her memory until her last day. From the doorway, Maximilian watched the scene with eyes that shone with something he no longer tried to hide: love, gratitude, reverence. A mix of emotions this woman, this extraordinary, impossible, wonderful woman, had awakened within him. The wedding ceremony took place on the first day of winter, beneath a soft snow that covered Stonehaven in a white mantle of purity. Aurora wore an ivory silk gown embroidered with silver threads, her hair braided with hothouse flowers that Beatrice had cultivated especially for the occasion. In her hands, she carried a simple bouquet of white roses, the same roses that bloomed in the garden where she had so often sat with the children. The great hall of the keep was filled with guests, but Aurora barely saw them. Her eyes were fixed on Maximilian, who waited for her before the makeshift altar, dressed in black and silver, more handsome than any man had a right to be. When she finally reached his side, he took her hands in his and smiled. That rare and precious smile he reserved just for her. "Ready?" he whispered. "I always have been," she replied. "I just didn't know it." The vows were exchanged with voices trembling with emotion. The rings slid into place, seals of a promise they both knew they would keep until